Thank you, Maria, for organizing these events every week. It takes work, so be sure to appreciate people that do things that you appreciate. So thank you, Maria, for organizing that. And thank you for inviting me back to speak with you guys. I didn't scare you off last time, and so I'm back here today, so that's probably a good sign. But you guys gave up a night of Netflix probably on a Tuesday night, or whatever it is you normally do, to come to an old-fashioned talk where you leave the house and you go to a place and hear about a thing, right? And going out and socializing with people. Hopefully we learn over the past few years that it's good to get out and socialize. It's not good to stay indoors all the time, right? So you guys are here with the common interest. So hopefully you meet somebody after the talk. We'll have a little bit of time to mingle and everything. And the hour doesn't start until I say the name of the title of the talk. Okay, so and we get started a little late. We'll make sure everybody got in here. After the talk, we are raffling off a copy of this book, brand new, fresh out of the bag. Still smells like a new book and everything. Never been cracked open. Mount Shasta, California's Mystic Mountain. Gives you a good primer on some of the mysteries of Mount Shasta in short little chapters that are very easy to read. So if you want to win that, you're here so you get entered. But if you want to win it, go ahead and see Carla afterward. And she will give you a ticket, and then 5 minutes after the talk ends, we'll do a raffle. And somebody here will walk home with it. So be sure to get your raffle ticket if you want to win. If you make it to the end, that is. This is an introduction to the mysteries of Mount Shasta, true stories, legends, and lore from America's spiritual mountain. I will start off with a disclaimer. I will be talking about different beliefs, about different sects and groups, because you can't talk about Mount Shasta without talking about interesting religious sects, because many of them were, and by that I mean groups, religious groups. And I will be talking about legends and lore, and I'll be speaking about them rather matter-of-factly. So at no time am I making any truth claims. I'm not here to proselytize or convince anybody of anything, right? This is informative, not a persuasive talk. So keep that in mind, okay? First, some background. Mount Shasta sits at the foot of the Cascade Mountain Range, a continuation of the Sierras. If you've been there, you know where it is. It's about an hour from the Oregon border, and it's the second highest peak in the range and the fifth highest in California. It rises 14,179 feet or so, and it's geologically interesting because, of course, many of you know, it's a volcano. There are miles and miles of lava tubes all over the place in that range, and part of what makes the place interesting. It's relatively actually active, geologically speaking. Over the past 10,000 years, Mount Shasta has erupted about 20 times or so, some major eruptions. And so that's an average about every 800 years or so. So you might ask, when did it last erupt? There's a reliable source that says that Mount Shasta had a major eruption around 1250 AD. So if you do the math, it's about 800 years. There are other reports of some sort of eruption event occurring in the late 18th century. So we're 200 to 800 years in. Either way, pretty much close to due. A recent U.S. Geological Survey actually labeled Mount Shasta as very high risk. That's the highest risk category you can get for a potential eruption event. So if all the stories you hear about Mount Shasta don't scare you away, hopefully the fact that it's an active volcano doesn't scare you away either. But that is an average. It could be 60 years from now. It could be 2,000 years. If we've learned anything, we know it's hard to predict earthquakes and volcanoes. I realized when I was putting this presentation together that one of two things would happen by the end of it. One, you will be inspired to take a trip up to Mount Shasta. I hope that's the case. Some of you have been there, I assume, right? It's interesting that so many people got together in a city to talk about some other city, right? And but hopefully you'll be inspired to visit Mount Shasta. If you're a nature lover, there's everything there is to do outdoors out there. You can go skiing, camping, fishing, swimming, kayaking. What else? You can go hunting. You can do lots of stuff out there at Mount Shasta. It's a really beautiful place, beautiful snow-capped mountain, and that might inspire you to go visit. Or if perhaps you're spiritually minded and you go because you've heard about the mountain's unique energy. And I'll objectively, there is a unique measurable energy that occurs in the mountain range of Mount Shasta, and sometimes planes kind of take little detours because there's electromagnetic energy that kind of affects the instrumentation on a plane. And if you know anything about flying, you want your instruments to be accurate, right? And so that's interesting, but other people go for spiritual reasons. Mount Shasta is the site and origin of many spiritual movements, and we will talk about that. So you might go for the nature, you might go because you're spiritually minded, or you're just interested in weird stuff. You're interested in the paranormal, right? Paranormal is a term I don't like, but you know what I'm talking about when I say it. It's considered one of the most paranormal places on the planet. All sorts of weird stuff, everything you can think of that's weird and unusual, in the category of high strangeness. You can bet that it happens in Mount Shasta for some reason, or at least we get reports of people saying that there's strange things happening out there. But the other thing that could happen is you might be scared away, and you might not want to go anywhere near the mountain after hearing this presentation because you heard of all these strange things that occur there. And indeed, there are people that go up Mount Shasta and they see the mountain and they take a look at it and it gives them the creeps. Right? They've heard the stories, they've heard these legends, they've heard the lore, and all about all the paranormal stuff, and they've heard stories from people that say, yeah, I'm not going, there's something weird happening when I was there, and they won't go anywhere near the mountain. That's the other thing that might happen by the end of this talk, but I hope it's the former rather than the latter. I hope you are inspired to take a trip out to Mount Shasta, either for the first time or back again, because you know it's such a cool place. Perhaps we can plan some kind of group retreat or event. You guys have done that in the past here, right? Haven't you? Right? I know conditions have changed, but perhaps, you know, something can be arranged. Any excuse to come to visit Mount Shasta, that would be a good thing. Now, you're either going to want to go there or you're not. When it comes to the spirituality of Mount Shasta, it is known worldwide. It's one of 7 spiritual mountains, one of the 7 sacred mountains known around the world. And you may be a person who's interested in the mysteries of life, have any questions about what life's all about the mysteries, the things we don't know about. And you may decide, I'm going to take a trip to some exotic place, perhaps to the jungles of India, or I'm going to go to Nepal and climb the highest mountain. I'm going to find a wise guru and ask him these questions I have about the mysteries of life. And when you get there, this is kind of a joke, but it actually happens. You ask them the questions and they tell you, oh, you should go to Mount Shasta. And so often the answers are very much close to home. When it comes to the different things that occur there, there are different beliefs that people have. People have these subjective experiences there. If you've ever had something strange happen and you tell a story and people say, oh, okay, that's weird, and then they kind of move on. But to you, it's something you think about every day, and I've had something weird happen to me before. Perhaps another time we'll tell you about it. But I can identify with people that report strange things occurring to them, because to them it really happened. You can tell they tell the stories, and it's true to them. And so I can appreciate that, and that's part of many of the reports that you get from things happening around Mount Shasta. Now, when it comes to the strange things that happen, I'll front load this with a few of the strange phenomena that occurs up there. Certainly people talk about the strange lights that are seen out in the meadows and around the mountain, out in the forest of Mount Shasta at night. We see these small, strange orbs of light that change colors or in size, and they'll float around. Sometimes people think they're people with flashlights, and often people that are lost out in the woods will say, oh, cool, people. And they go follow the lights, and they end up finding their way back home onto the trail, so maybe they think those lights are a good thing. But there are stories, there are tales, there are legends of the local native population there that say these are, in fact, evil entities or evil, malevolent spirits. And they even say that they are harbingers of misfortune and death. Right? So if you heard that about Mount Shasta, you probably don't want to be out there at night. It's all according to your subjective experience. You see them either as good according to the stories you've heard, or bad. And that the bad tends to stick with us a lot more, right? And so we don't know what they are, but in fact people see these strange orbs of light in the meadows and in the woods around Mount Shasta. Some people are guided home, other people run the other way because they are often associated with negative events. People like fall strange lights. So that's one of the things that people see out there. Of course, Mount Shasta is a UFO hotspot. Of course, many of you know that. It is one of the top UFO hotspots around the world. So people interested in UFOs and seeing something might travel from around the world to see the UFOs at Mount Shasta. In the 1970s, there was a rash of strange sightings on the roads and around the mountain. You see these large spheres of light flying around. Other people have reported strange cubes flying around the mountain, or these cigar-shaped craft. And they report seeing these craft fly directly into the mountain, almost as if there was some hidden portal or entryway there, some clandestine entry into the mountain. They fly right into the rock side, it seems, almost as if there's some kind of a base in there, or some kind of civilization living in there, and some people certainly believe that's the case. In the 1970s, there was a case when a lady actually claimed she was abducted by one of these and spoke to the creatures in there, and she asked them, where are you from? And according to her story, the being said, well, we tell you, but you don't understand how the universe works, or the nature of the universe. So whatever that means, right? And certainly people continue to claim to see unusual things at Mount Shasta. They claim to encounter these UFOs and their pilots, or whatever they are. And they also claim to come in contact with interdimensional beings or members of a remnant of a lost civilization that resides deep within Mount Shasta. Many of you heard that legend, of course. The Lemurians, and we'll get deep into this. Now, a little front load this with some rapid-fire phenomena that occurs there. The majority of this talk will focus on the central lore that makes Mount Shasta so interesting. And that, of course, is the lore and the stories, the legends, and some say the true stories of encounters with Lemurians and Lemuria, the city of Telos, deep inside of Mount Shasta. So whether you believe or not, I'm presenting this in an objective way. You can decide for yourself, or go check it out, see if you can run into a Lemurian. The other thing that makes Mount Shasta what it is all the many spiritual religious groups that have arisen in that area, certainly alternative spirituality. And one of the phenomena that's very similar to the Lemurians is that of the ascended masters, or sighting of ascended masters. It's kind of, in a sense, they're kind of like saints that people see out there that instruct humans. And people have claimed to have run into those, and it has certainly influenced the history of Mount Shasta, and it's a part of the mystery of Mount Shasta. I'll leave the kind of rapid-fire phenomenon with one story that you probably haven't heard as much. We've heard about the Lemurians, but there is some folklore about another race of beings that live inside of Mount Shasta, known as the Yactavians. Anybody heard of those? Yactavians. They're said to be master bell makers, and they use these bells for utility, for practical purposes. Again, I'm telling the story. Okay? Don't go telling people that Edgar said there's people with bells. And I don't know if I believe it. I'm just telling the perspective of the story. Okay? These Yactavians are master bell makers, and they use these bells. They've perfected the art. They make chimes and bells of all sizes to resonate at the exact frequency to fulfill a practical purpose. And so they use these bells to hollow out entire sections of the mountain to create the layer and the place where they live inside the mountain. They're even said to use other bells and chimes to resonate, to create light that they need to survive in their city inside the mountain, even as security. If you go near the entrance, they say you'll hear this high-pitched ring, and that'll keep you away. So they use the bells as security. And some people claim that, again, they're lost out in the woods. You'll notice these themes that come along with these stories, and part of what may connect things. People are lost out in the woods, and they begin hearing this ringing coming from the mountain. They don't know how to get back, so they start following this ringing. Surely somebody's causing it, and eventually it fades, and they find themselves back on the trail or somewhere familiar. So they say that the Yactavians guided them back home. And so perhaps they're good beings, bad beings, I don't know. But people have also claimed to be in their car, in their Jeep or truck or whatever, around Mount Shasta, and their car shuts off just while they're driving down the road. And they hear this high-pitched ringing, and it's kind of uncomfortable, and it dissipates eventually, and then their car fires back up again. So some people say, oh, I heard that it seems that like their technology interferes with ours every now and then. That of the Yactavians and their master bell-making skills inside the mountain. So that's one of the legends, one part of the lore of Mount Shasta that you may not have heard of. So if anything, can take away a new story from this event. But when it comes to the spirituality of Mount Shasta, like I said, it is one of the hot spots for people that are interested in spiritual matters, and so they'll travel to Mount Shasta. But it all began, of course, with the natives that live in the area. Mount Shasta is home to several tribes, including the Klamath, the Modoc, what else? The Wintu, Shasta, the Karuk Indians, Pit River Indians, and several others. And there are themes that run throughout their stories, right? Their oral tradition, and occasionally tribes that never come in contact with each other will have very similar stories. And so we'll focus on two of these right now. One of them is a being called, what the Wintu called a Sebchut. A Sebchut is a giant. The many native tribes around there all tell stories of living or interacting with or having to deal with these giants, a race of giants that live around Mount Shasta. And actually throughout California and other native oral traditions will have these stories about interacting with giants. Over, I think it's in Nevada or somewhere around there, the Paiutes have a story of these red-headed giants that they're always dealing with. And so they got tired of dealing with them, and they tricked them and chased them into a cave and then set fire to the entrance, much to the demise of these giants, these red-headed giants that were causing trouble. Hey, they were causing trouble. Most of the stories kind of involve these giants kind of harming members of the tribe. So typically the story you get is a tribal member will come to the village and say, hey, there's a giant and he's hurting people, and it might come back injured or something like that. He got away, right? Or he's eating people, he's eating some of the villagers, and as the story goes, they get together, they go and they deal with the giant, either successfully or not. But if they kill the giant, they'll throw his body in the river and weigh it down or bury it. And that's a common theme in a lot of the stories. One of the things that the Wintu say about these giants is whenever you see astronomical phenomena, a comet shooting through the sky or a shooting star, that is the giants flying through space. And these giants live underground in the many tunnels that are under Mount Shasta, in these caves. So they emerge from these caves inside of Mount Shasta. They're very tall, and for some reason they say that these are the giants flying through space every now and then. So when you see astronomical phenomena or lights flying around the mountain, that's the giants. Really strange, right? And so we can compare that to modern lore, modern legends or stories that people say about Mount Shasta here as we continue. One of the other themes that runs throughout many of the tribe's stories is they say you never go above the tree line in Mount Shasta. You guys might have heard that one, right? There's a forest, rich forest around Mount Shasta on the mountain, but as soon as you get 8,000, 10,000 feet, no more trees because the air is quite thin up there. And so they say that people must never go up there, for that is the realm of the sacred people, or the sacred beings, and some say sky people, sky beings. And the Wintu there will pray to the sacred people up there. But they say people must never go up there. But you can climb the mountain, you can go up there. And there's nothing but rock, ice, and snow, but people summit the mountain every year all the time. But on occasion, there have been actually quite several missing persons that go missing under strange circumstances. And if you ask the local indigenous people, they'll say, well, you're not supposed to be up there. And so perhaps the sacred sky beings got them, right? Or you ask the locals, they'll say the Lemurians got them. There's a case of Carl Landers that you can read about, and others. A guy who disappeared off of a place called 50/50, and he disappeared between there and a place when he goes up to Lake, I think it's called Lake Helena, something like that. And it's a very short distance, and there's nowhere for him to disappear to. And he walked off, and he kind of disappeared. He's supposed to meet his friends, and nobody knows where he went. And they say he's not on the mountain, so he's either off the mountain or inside the mountain. And that would go along with the people that say the sky people or the Lemurians got to him. So the bulk of my talk will focus here on these Lemurians and the lore of the Lemurians. Has anybody here not heard of the Lemurians at Mount Shasta? Holler out, because that would help me out.
There's like a couple hands.
A few people never heard of the Lemurians. Okay, so you're in for probably more information than you have wanted. Now, here's how the story goes. According to the lore, I'm putting everything together for you. According to the legends, to the stories, the Lemurians are a remnant of a race of beings whose continent sunk into the ocean. The remainder of these, perhaps 10,000 or so, survived and moved over to Northern California throughout the coast in different locations, particularly at Mount Shasta. And they say that they are in Mount Shasta or under Mount Shasta in some respects, and they live in a city, a beautiful crystal and gold multi-layered city by the name of Telos. You guys have heard this story. But the city name is Telos. These Lemurians are described as very tall. People actually describe them as 7, 8 feet tall or more, range in height, just like we do, right? But typically they say they're about 7 or 8 feet tall, clothed in some kind of white robe or white garment, a tunic, and a belt. They wear jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, things like that. And they're quite attractive. They're said to have like long hair, really Nordic looking, and said to have a somewhat of a walnut-sized appendage on their forehead, kind of like a bump on their forehead. That's quite unusual. And people say that that houses an organ that allows them to communicate with each other, either telepathically or provide some kind of enhanced psychic ability. That's according to the stories, the lore, and the legends. Let's see what else. Every now and then people will encounter these beings. They'll be up on the mountain by themselves, and according to their very seemingly sincere reports, they ran into this 7-foot creature that just popped out of this kind of cave that the side of the mountain where there wasn't a cave before. And the being beckons to them and says, "Would you like to see Telos?" And then I don't know what I would do in that situation. I don't think I would go in there. Right? Those of you who would are either really excited on Shasta and Telos, or are you those kids that would get in the car with the guy with the hand? But I don't know. If a 7-foot tall being came out of an opening of a granite rock and invited me in there, now knowing all this lore, I don't know, maybe I would. All right, so if you don't hear from me again. But people report this all the time, and I'll tell you about some people that do that more than others. In the 1930s, that's a time of lots of spiritual movements being developed during the Great Depression. Certain spiritual movements, New Age movements, were gaining in popularity. That's when New Thought was developing around that time, right? Some of you are familiar with that. And a lot of things mixed together, and a lot of religious groups came together, very much under or adopting the lore and literature and beliefs about Lemuria. And I'll get more into that. But in the 1930s, there's a famous report of a writer named Edgar Ortega. And you can look up this article. It was published in the LA Times and told all about his experiences there. He was on a train. There used to be a train that ran through the area near Mount Shasta. And the story goes he was up early one morning. He couldn't sleep on the train, and so he went to the observation car, and he looked at the window, and he saw these strange lights lighting up past the mountain. These bright colored lights. And he's like, "Oh, that's weird." He looked for smoke. He didn't smell or see any smoke. He would notice it, and he kept lighting up half the mountain. Beautiful colored lights. And so later he asked the conductor, "Hey, what were those lights over Mount Shasta?" And the conductor just very nonchalantly told him, "Oh, that's the Lemurians. They do their ceremonials early in the morning." And he's like, "Lemurians? What are you talking about?" And he went around the towns. Around Mount Shasta, you can go to the city of Mount Shasta. Lots of little shops, great place you can go. There's also the towns of Dunsmuir, McLeod, and of course Wheat is down there. He went down and investigated, and he's been asking around, and you heard these Lemurians. And some of these shopkeepers, the business owners down there, they'd say, "Oh yeah, they come in here every now and then, and they buy stuff, and they pay with gold, and we try to give them the change, but I don't really have enough change, or they won't accept it, right? Almost as if they have plenty of a big supply, but they don't really see it as worth like we might." And so they liked them because 1930s, what's going on around that time? Great Depression. And so anybody bringing in gold was welcome, right? And very nonchalantly, they just say, "Yeah, they come in, they come down, they live up on the mountain, they buy stuff." What kind of stuff did they buy? Well, they buy like salt and lard, sulfur. Okay. And so the guy's like, "Okay," so he put that in the mountain in the article. And again, this is an article you can look up, you can read it. And so he talked about that. Very strange. Another case associated with the same time was given a report by a fellow who was, what was his name? Oh, his name was Edgar. I should know that. His name was Edgar Larkin, and he was a professor, an astronomer. He was the director, actually, of the Mount Observatory in Southern California. And the story goes, as he tells it, or as the story is told, is he was near Mount Shasta, testing out his telescopes, and he focused it on a part of the mountain, and he said it started seeing some lights and things, and he saw this beautiful golden dome, and it was connected to a larger structure, and he saw that it was a building made of marble and crystalline material of some kind, and there's different things. He saw them doing different things on there, and it's a building, almost like a little city. They were doing stuff, but it's not really there in the daytime. They couldn't really find it ever, and so for several days, Professor Larkin would train his telescope early in the morning, around the same time that was reported by the LA Times writer, and he would see this, and that was his report, and he'd see these things, these strange things, but really there's nothing out there where he was focused his telescope, so that's part of the reports of the sightings of these Lemurians supposedly doing their ceremonials out on the mountain, almost as if it's in this hidden location where it would appear for specific purposes for some people to see. Who knows? But there are cases recently of people that insist they were taken inside the mountain and they saw Telos. They saw the crystal golden city, and they described it multi-level. There's a place where there's agriculture. They grow food, and he met some of the leaders of Telos, and he claims to just interact with them on a regular basis now. If you're interested and want to hear his story, see if you believe him or not, you can look him up. He's on YouTube. And on YouTube, he's been doing all the interviews on all the metaphysical podcasts. People have been interviewing him. His name is Lowell Johnson. Yeah, I think that's his name. Lowell Johnson. And he talks about having visited Telos. And he gives a lot of detail. And he's been using AI to create these images to try to communicate what he saw. And he says that in the middle of the city, there's this big, beautiful pyramid, and they have light in there somehow, and advanced technology. They have flying craft and transportation, and it's really beautiful. And this race of Lemurians live underneath Mount Shasta, according to him. So if you want to look him up, feel free. Lowell Johnson. He's been giving several interviews on YouTube about Mount Shasta, and his story is pretty typical. He went up on the mountain in search, and he was on the Shastina side. If you see Mount Shasta, there's two mountains, and he was on the Shastina side. Shastina is the other kind of mountain that you see that is pretty conspicuous. But when it comes to recent sightings, Lowell Johnson is who you want to check out to see about his experience. So watch it, let me know what you think. I'm not giving my opinion on it right now. But people have similar experiences out there. They'll see one of these beings that they don't want to be seen, all of a sudden they hop up on a rock and they're gone, right? A similar phenomenon that occurs around Mount Shasta when it comes to strange things that are encountered there is something similar, and that is that of encounters with the ascended masters. Ascended masters, like I said, are kind of like almost like these New Age saints, and I'll talk more about that. But if there's one work that brings together the stories, the legends about Lemurians, ascended masters, these kind of saints around Mount Shasta, and Mount Shasta, put it all together, it would have to be due to one work that was written in 1883, took about 3 years to write, that became an occult classic, and people continue to read it to this day, and it's a work called A Dweller on Two Planets, or A Dividing of the Way. And here we have examples, mentions of Lemuria, mentions of Mount Shasta, and ascended masters. Now, I'll give a synopsis of the book because it's relevant. The book is special because it's said to have been written by an ascended master, one of these individuals that has overcome the karmic cycle and ascended to a new level of understanding of the universe and remains behind to teach humans that he might come in contact with who are ready to receive this wisdom, this information. And according to the story, it was written by an ascended master named Philos the Tibetan. And he wrote it through his amanuensis, Frederick Spencer Oliver. And Amanuensis is a secretary. Somebody has the means to do the writing. Philos the Tibetan is said to have channeled the work through Frederick Spencer Oliver, a teenager at the time. He was 17 or 18. And one day, Frederick Spencer Oliver, the human author of A Dweller on Two Planets, his hand began to shake. And he began shaking harder, and it seemed like he was having a seizure, and people weren't sure what to do, and it lasted for hours. And then it would stop and start up again. And then somebody thought, well, let's put a pen in his hands. And they gave him paper, and according to the story, he began writing and writing and writing. And it turns out this was Philos the Tibetan writing through him. And in the introduction to the book, he gives an account. He makes it known that this is not my work. I am not the author of this work, but Philos the Tibetan speaking through me to give a message to humanity, or however you want to frame it. And that's how the story goes. And he insists that he did not write it. He didn't even publish it. Later on, he passed away, and his mother published it. But a synopsis, a summary of it, I'll give it to you, and you might thank me if you try to read it, because it's a short book but a long read, if that makes sense. It's in 3 parts. The first part describes, the whole book describes the various incarnations, the embodiments, the past lives of Philos the Tibetan before he became an ascended master. Part 1 describes his life in Atlantis as an individual living on Atlantis. It talks about his struggles, his karmic struggles, and his life and death there. Part 2 ties into Mount Shasta, in which he lives his life as a man named Walter Pearson, working as a miner in the Mount Shasta area, and one of his associates clues him in to some of the mysteries of the universe and takes him into the mountain, to this strange chamber where he is initiated into occult secrets, the mysteries of the universe, and he's shown many wonderful, interesting things, and it kind of changes him. And so it gives the rest of his life, his karmic struggles in life, and his death, and it talks about that. Part 3 is about the past incarnations of Philos the Tibetan before he was in Atlantis. But ultimately, the book aims to tell us of the overcoming of Philos the Tibetan, of breaking the karmic cycle. We think of the Buddha, right? No longer cycles through anymore, and he became an ascended master, joining the ranks of Siddhartha Gautama the Buddha, Jesus Christ. People believe in these circles who might be an ascended master, also Saint Germain, and many others. A lot of this philosophy, a lot of this theology came from some of the leaders in the spiritual movements at the time. I don't know what you guys are into, but if you're interested in theology, A Dweller on Two Planets is interesting in that it combines Western and Eastern ideas, in the sense that it connects grace, which is connected to the Christian tradition, right? Western Christian tradition, and karma, of course, of the Eastern tradition. And it describes how these two can be integrated together, how they relate to one another, and how it affects the life and can be used by the spiritual practitioner. So kind of integrating these interfaith concepts, A Dweller on Two Planets does that. And so if you're interested in that sort of thing, that's the sort of thing that goes on in part of the reason that it's such an occult classic. So a lot of the spiritual movements around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, of course, became quite popular around that time. Depression was going on, and apparently in times of trouble, it's easy to kind of start up new faiths, new religious movements. And one of the things that one of those leaders, you might have heard of Helena Blavatsky, right? She was co-founder of the Theosophical Society, the Theosophists, and she was one of the first to talk about Lemuria as this place in the Pacific. Now, let me talk about, let me go back a little bit to Lemuria. Lemuria is, we've talked about Lemurians living in Mount Shasta. A lot of people today think of Lemuria as this continent in the Pacific Ocean, right? That sank for whatever reason. There's various accounts of that. And then the survivors came to Mount Shasta, and that's where they reside in Telos. But the idea of Lemuria actually stemmed from a, I think, 19th century zoologist who noticed that there were lemurs in Madagascar, and there were lemur fossils that they find in India, mainland India, but none around mainland Africa, and none around the Arabian Peninsula. And so it's like, how did these lemurs get from Madagascar over here to India, or vice versa? And so he proposed a theory that was published in a scientific paper, that was published in a scientific journal, where he proposed a land bridge of some sort, or a continent connecting Madagascar with the mainland in India. And he proposed the name of it being Lemuria. Okay? And so it's because the lemurs were going back and forth. So it's Lemuria. A lot of people mispronounce it. They say Lemuria, right? I think think of the moon or light, very mystical sounding, right? So it's say, yeah, Lemuria, light, or the moon, whatever. No, it's actually lemurs. So it's Lemuria, and that's where the idea came from. And so how did this idea of this continent that apparently sunk into the ocean, or at least partially, stranding these populations of lemurs, how did we get from that to addressing this continent in the Pacific Ocean? Well, during the end of the 19th century, a lot of these spiritual movements were talking about lost continents. They talk about Atlantis, right? You've heard of Atlantis, and a lot of esoteric teachings, a lot of Gnostic, Christian mystics were getting involved in many of the movements that were going on here. And Helena Blavatsky, the co-founder of the Theosophist Society that we talked about, is one that's often credited as first attaching the name Lemuria from this island or this continent that existed in the Indian Ocean to that of the Pacific Ocean. And later on, one of the leaders of the Rosicrucians was a guy named Harvey Spencer Lewis, and he wrote a book called Lemuria, Lost Continent in the Pacific. But before that, there was a fellow in 1926 who published a book called The Lost Continent of Mu, a fellow by the name of James Churchward. And he proposed, and well, he told us in the book, that he encountered, while visiting India, Tibet, some tablets that was shown to him by some monks at a monastery. And the monks showed it to him, and they helped him translate them. And according to Churchward, these tablets revealed an entire civilization, an entire continent that was lost, that once resided in the Pacific Ocean. He called this continent Mu, or rather, he told us what the tablets said. And he cited that at some point, due to volcanic activity, the continent sunk into the ocean rather quickly. There's many variations of this depending on who you talk to. But Churchward believed it sunk into the ocean quite rapidly due to volcanic events. And then he described this society as being members of a group of people called the Nakal. The tablets were preserved by the Nakal Brotherhood, people who were entrusted to preserve the culture, to preserve the writings and history of this Nakal civilization on the continent he claims is called Mu in the Pacific Ocean. He gave various evidences. You can read the book. It's quite well written. It's easy to read. I read it in a couple sessions. But he cites evidence from archaeology that connects everything back to Mu. So he has those tablets. He claims that that he read, he had access to, and he connected everything. And he seemed very genuine about it because he wrote quite extensively. He wrote several subsequent books after that. But he cites evidence of archaeology from Mexico, from the surrounding Pacific Islands, to the United States, and all the way, maybe perhaps even out to near New Zealand. And he also used evidence from symbolism. He connected different symbols and language, etymology. He connected all these things back to this civilization that lived in the Pacific on the continent of Mu, the Nakal people. At the time, that really helped out because a lot of these spiritual groups that were rising up at the time were kind of adopting this idea of lost continents, and that kind of fueled the fire. And so slowly over time, both from Henry Spencer Lewis and his book as well, started transferring this, calling Lemuria out in the Indian Ocean to this place in the Pacific Ocean. So that means that if these Lemurians exist in Mount Shasta, if indeed their continent sank into the ocean, and they live in Mount Shasta and Telos, if you're on Mount Shasta and some guy comes out and says, "Hey, I'm the king of Lemuria," and he's 7 feet tall, okay, I'll give him that. They wouldn't call themselves Lemurians because that term was made up by people, right? Because the lemurs somewhere else. But for the sake of argument, they do speak English apparently. And so, if they studied our language, they'll say, oh, they call us Lemurians. Okay, so, hey, I'm the king of Lemuria, so I got him an out for that, right? Okay, but here we have these Lemurians. Now we have a history. We have a history of a society that once existed in the Pacific Ocean. 64 million people. There was a continent sank into the ocean. They moved into Mount Shasta, and ever since then, people have seen signs of them. They somehow saved it some technology, and they created things, and perhaps they're connected to those UFOs. People like to say that it's connected to a lot of the phenomena that occurs around Mount Shasta. And I don't have time to tell you about all the strange things that happen around Mount Shasta, but because some of them I won't even mention because it just seems so crazy. But many people attribute a lot of the phenomena to these Lemurians. Okay, so we got the Lemurians, and then we'll go back to the Ascended Masters. The Ascended Masters, like I said, greatly influenced, or rather the book we talked about, Dweller on Two Planets, greatly influenced the spiritual movements at the time. The Rosicrucians, the Theosophists, there's other groups that arose that adopted Lemurian lore. There's one called the Brotherhood of the White Temple Church. That was started by a guy named Morris Doreal. And one that arose around that same time called the Lemurian Fellowship. And they built their whole philosophy, their whole religion on this idea that Lemuria was a very real place. And I know years ago, I don't know if they still have it now, but years ago they're based out in San Diego. They had a compound out there on top of the mountain. And that's where they live, Lemurian Fellowship. We'll call them a religious sect for now, okay? But you can, they make YouTube videos. You can take their courses and become a part of the Lemurian Fellowship. This is one of these groups that rose up there, and they take it very seriously. They seem like really nice people and everything. So the Rosicrucians, the Brotherhood of White Temple Church, that was another group, and they thought that not in Mount Shasta was not the Lemurians, but the Atlanteans that lived in Mount Shasta. And according to that story, I think it was Morris Doreal who said it. He believes that it was the Atlanteans that moved into Mount Shasta because they're at war with the Lemurians. And according to some of the stories, some of the lore, they believe that the Atlanteans and the Lemurians had a conflict because the Atlanteans, of course, and the Lemurians were advanced. And they wanted to be more bossy and subjugate the rest of humanity. And the Lemurians, they're saying, no, don't do that, just leave them alone. And of course, they were at war. It was said they had advanced technology, some kind of nuclear war broke out, and they sunk each other into the ocean. So that's another story about how the two continents sunk into the ocean. But who knows? There are reports existing of Atlantis from Plato and Proclus and the other peripheral areas, but still, they're still considered mythical places unless you talk to the people that have encounters with these Lemurians over in Mount Shasta. But anyway, around 1930, there was a woman named Nola Van Valen, and she went to visit Mount Shasta with her husband and a group of friends. And they were on the mountain, and they came upon this large black rock with strange writing on it. And this writing, they were examining it, and it opened up, and there came this door. And according to Nola Van Valen, it revealed this chamber inside of Mount Shasta, where she met and encountered an ascended master. Guess who it was? Philos the Tibetan. And she also met other ascended masters in there. And she's very genuine about it, and she told everybody about it. She said she had all these witnesses, the 33 other people and her husband, and she'd return year after year to visit that southeast side of the mountain where she first encountered Philos the Tibetan, who began to teach her things. And between 1930 and 1940, Nola Van Valen visited Mount Shasta and was instructed by Philos the Tibetan on Mount Shasta. Eventually, she moved to Mount Shasta, and in 1960, she started a school up there. It was called the Radiant School of Seekers and Servers. And she ran it. She taught the things, the wisdom that she gleaned from Philos the Tibetan, the Ascended Master, and the other Ascended Masters that she met in this strange chamber. Very reminiscent of some of the stories we hear in Dweller on Two Planets. But it's interesting. You can read an interview with Nola Van Valen if you win this book. She talks about it. But afterwards, she passed away eventually, and her movement, her school, didn't last. It kind of fizzled out after a while. But a significant kind of beginning to the legacy of ascended masters of Mount Shasta. You can't talk about Mount Shasta without talking about another ascended master known as Saint Germain. And there's a very famous case about another religious movement that rose up at Mount Shasta, head up by a couple, or by the name of Guy and Ballard. They were from Chicago, and according to Ballard, he was on the southeast side of the mountain in 1930, so around the same time as Nola Van Valer. And according to him, he was hiking, and he bent down to fill up his cup from one of the springs and to take a drink. When suddenly a young man appeared behind Guy Ballard and said, "I have a more refreshing drink for you," and offered him this strange drink. He drank it. Again, he's taking candy from the guy in the car. No, but he felt comfortable, and so he drank this drink instead of from the spring, and he said immediately he felt electricity running through his body, and he felt an immense sense of clarity. Very unusual. This young man eventually transfigured himself and revealed to himself to be the Count of Saint Germain, the ascended master. Very prominent figure in ascended master history when it comes to Mount Shasta. The idea of ascended masters was largely brought up or revived again by Helena Blavatsky, and is a big part of what we know now about these ascended master lores, so something to keep in mind. But anyway, Guy Ballard was shown many things by Saint Germain. He was taken from his body, taken around the world, taken through time, even encountering his past incarnations, his embodiments, his past lives. And during August, September, and October of 1930, according to Ballard, he was taught many things and shown many incredible things. And he wrote this all in a book called Unveiled Mysteries. And he used the pen name Godfrey Ray King, and he wrote several subsequent books about his teachings with Saint Germain. And he used these series of writings as a corpus, as the canon for a religious movement that he began called the I Am activity, the I Am movement. Kind of similar to things you might have heard. But he combined many elements of spiritualism, stuff from the Rosicrucians, the Theosophists, from Dweller on Two Planets. If you hear, he was taken out of his body, shown his past lives, taken around the world, right? Very similar to the story of Philos the Tibetan in Dweller on Two Planets. So some people say he borrowed heavily from it, or it's simply similar because it's part of the similar legends and lore from Mount Shasta. But he claims that it was real, and he started a religious movement in 1932, 1934, preaching all over, and they said he got up to like over 1 million members who joined the I Am activity movement. Very influential at the time. He preached, there was a lot of prosperity preaching, right? So in a time when people were hurting in the Great Depression, prosperity preaching was quite popular. And he added the spiritualism and different things. And he had some unusual teachings that people criticized him for, but I won't get into that. There were lawsuits involved and things like that. But, he had a religious sect, we'll call it, okay? And it was based out of Mount Shasta. And according to it, his believers believe that at some point he might be transfigured, become an ascended master himself. And he promised the same thing, an instruction on how you could ascend and become an ascended master. And he made everybody buy the books, and it was kind of expensive considering the time, right? If you wanted to be a member, be really committed, you had to buy all the books and you had to read them. The movement became quite popular, but he did eventually, they thought he would be transfigured, like in the Bible. There are a couple people that never died in the Bible. Anybody know who they are? Enoch never died, and Elijah, he was taken in a chariot of fire. Remember that? And so kind of you can think of that idea of being transfigured. And so they figured Guy Ballard, he would become an ascended master. He would be transfigured, never tasting bodily death. He passed away eventually, though, of a cirrhosis of the liver. Well, he did pass away of cirrhosis, so a lot of people were like, oh man, because they were following this guy that bought all the books, right? So they got quite disillusioned by Guy Ballard, and so many fell away. But his wife and her wisdom and his wife in her wisdom came back and tried to do what she could to save as much of the flock as possible. And the I Am activity movement continued, and it still exists to this day. You can go to Mount Shasta and visit the I Am reading room, where they have all of Godfrey Ray King, Guy Ballard's reading material, as well as they have their own school there, and I believe some kind of compound where they do whatever it is they do. They founded the Saint Germain Foundation too. So, but it's a part of Mount Shasta's history. People continue to claim to see ascended masters, to be taught by them around Mount Shasta. So for these people, for their beliefs, they go and hopefully try to have an encounter with one of these beings. If you want to follow another guy who claims to have been in contact with Saint Germain, who's an interesting study in himself, if you ever want to learn about an interesting life, study Saint Germain. You can go on YouTube, and you might have heard of him. His name is Peter Mount Shasta. And he tells stories about encountering Saint Germain, and he teaches several things. He's a really nice guy. He seems like he's kind of like a older guy, hippie guy. And he's traveled through India and all over the place, and he tells all sorts of cool stories. It really seems like a really nice guy, but eventually he changed his name to Peter Mount Shasta. And you can look it up on YouTube, and he'll tell you his stories of his encounters with the ascended masters. So, giants living in caves under Mount Shasta. Right? These stories of giants flying through space somehow, evolving eventually into stories of these beings that live under the mountain in the city of Telos, underground in Mount Shasta. Very tall beings, right? And who have craft and fly around. And people see them all the time. They say, hey, maybe that's the Lemurians. Very similar, right? You can see how this mythology can evolve. Or perhaps were the native people there seeing something similar? Did they change their policy? Did they stop eating the Indians? I don't know, right? But you could try to make these connections of the giants, and then we turn to Lemurians, right? And I talked to several people that says they've been in Lemuria, been in Telos. Some people say you can find Telos physically if you find the right latitude and get directions, have a map, you can find it on this physical plane. Others say that you have to have raised your vibration to a certain level to be able to see Telos and these Lemurians who don't often reveal themselves in 3D world, that they exist in some fourth, fifth dimensional realm, but still in and around Mount Shasta. That's what that guy, Lowell Johnson, claims. He was up there, and he says that someday soon, everybody will know about Telos and Mount Shasta. And so then we have the Ascended Masters. People still continue to this day. It's affected the history and the lore about Mount Shasta. You can see how it's evolved over time. And many people continue to go there to visit Lemurians and have an encounter with Ascended Masters. One last story that connects Mount Shasta with close to home. And think about the past stories that I talked about Telos, and the different things in the mountain. Philos the Tibetan, when he was Walter Pearson, found this strange chamber in Mount Shasta where he was shown many interesting things, and dweller on two planets, that sort of thing. This is a story you guys probably have heard, or you may not have heard it for the first time, and all the better. In 1904, there was a fellow named J.C. Brown, and he worked for the Lord Cadre Mining Company. It was a British mining company, and he was sent out here to the Cascade Mountains to look for gold for the company. And the story goes, he was in the Cascade Mountains in 1904, we sank around Mount Shasta, and he encountered a strange rockfall. And so he went to investigate it, and it seemed a little odd, and so he dug away at it, and behind the rockfall, he saw that it was covering up an entrance, either a lava tube or some kind of mining operation that had long since been abandoned. And he followed it and followed it and followed it, he says, for miles. He went deep under the mountain. Eventually, J.C. Brown came upon some sort of an underground village or crypt with several chambers. There was a chamber with beautiful, what he called something like hieroglyphics, and there were artifacts or weapons, shields with different types of writing, tablets with what he called something akin to cuneiform, right? Very ancient looking. He came upon all these artifacts, all this art, and he eventually came upon a chamber. And in it, there were several tombs. And within these tombs, there were several bodies, skeletons, or mummies. Two of them were larger than the others, and they were adorned in a rather reverent way, as if they were something important. So this was either a crypt or some village, some artifacts that at some point were left behind. The smallest of these bodies was 6.5 feet tall. The tallest of them was over 10 feet tall.
Wow.
And so these bodies, according to the story, J.C. Brown measured them, and he was in there for hours taking notes. They were everywhere from 6.5 feet, 8 feet, to over 10 feet tall. And so this is really fascinating. I don't even know what to do with all this. And so he took notes. He was in there for a long time until eventually he left, and he covered the entrance open, not sure what to do. He's thinking, maybe if I report this, the mining company's going to take all this, right? And he wasn't sure. And so he kind of kept it to himself. It was an area that was quite remote, and he knew that nobody would ever find it, considering the rockfall and how remote the area was on the side of the cliff, or however he described it. And so for 30 years, he kept it to himself, but he began doing research. He read James Churchward's book, The Lost Continent of Mute. He read the book Lemuria, The Lost Continent of the Pacific, and he started putting things together. He says, I must have run into a chamber of artifacts that give evidence to the existence of the Lemurian civilization. And there's no claim that they were there now, but perhaps at some point there was some evidence that these beings existed in Mount Shasta, or in the Cascade Mountains. We think he was on Mount Shasta. And so he studied, and he obsessed, and then once he retired, he said, I want to reveal this to the world. I want to show everybody these artifacts, and everything I've found and everything I've talked about is true. This has to be the residents of Mute, residents of Lemuria. And I found evidence of it. So he wanted to reveal it to the world. So guess where he popped up in 1934? He popped up in Stockton.
Oh.
And he got together with people. He started giving lectures. He needed a crew, right? You can't go getting all this out. And so he started to get a crew of workers. He got scientists together. He started giving lectures at a house on San Joaquin Street. And he even got people involved that were local. The curator of the Hagen Museum was one of those people that jumped on board. And so he said, oh, okay, we're going to get everybody together. We're going to do this finally. And so he got this expedition ready. He got 80 people, 70 to 80 people together who were ready to go finally reveal these things to the world. And so the next day they're going to leave and take off from the port and go up to the Cascade Mountains. He's going to take his crew and finally face again what he had seen 30 years ago and reveal this to all the world. He never showed up the next day. And these people say, oh, he was a con, take people money. I got to fund this operation. But he never did that. He either funded it all himself, but he never took any money from anybody, according to what people say. And so Stockton police investigated, and they're like, well, we can't find him. We know what happened. It's possible there might be some evidence that he was abducted. And so then, speculation. People say, oh, somebody, because he was so vocal about it, somebody found out about it, and they did not want him showing the world his discovery. That's one theory. Other people think the Lemurians found out about it. They didn't want anybody finding out about it, and so they offered him some sort of deal. So perhaps he got to live out the rest of his years inside of Lemuria. Who knows? If you want to read this story, it was published in 1934 in June in the Stockton Record. You can look up the article. That's where we get this story. That's the legend of J.C. Brown. Obviously, there's this mystery. He was never seen again. He just disappeared. Now, some people think this case was resolved. There's another article. If you type this, you'll probably find it. It's called Stockton and Lemuria Case Closed, where a paranormal investigator did some research, and he believes he solved the case, and perhaps J.C. Brown is another person entirely. But I think if you read the article, you'll find that the mystery remains quite open-ended. So, Mount Shasta, J.C. Brown, Lemuria, connected right here to Stockton. Feel free to check on all those things, read those articles after. So hopefully you were somewhat interested in some of the stuff we talked about. You've been educated a little bit, learned something about the lore and legends and mysteries of Mount Shasta today. Obviously, we can take any portion of this topic and extend it out more, but I won't do that to you. But for now, I encourage you to take a trip out to Mount Shasta. You can like it, you can enjoy it, whether you're a man or a woman. Mount Shasta has traits that we can all appreciate. Of the masculine, Mount Shasta is tall, strong, a little bit has the potential for danger, right? It's a stoic mountain. Of the feminine, Mount Shasta is beautiful, mysterious, and a source of life, a sustainer of life. And like all things feminine, we are intrigued by her many secrets. Thank you for your kind attention today. I'll be down here. I can't move around very well in the crowd, but I'll be down here if you guys want to say hi, say that you were here, or ask me any questions. Otherwise, we'll be here for a lot longer. We'll do the raffle, California's Mystic Mountain.